30 miles north of New York City, hidden behind stone walls and private roads, sits one of America's most exclusive estates. Kikit, the crown jewel of the Rockefeller family's 3,400-acre Pocantico Hills compound, looks out over the Hudson River from its hilltop perch like a fortress. The 40-room mansion, built in the classical revival style, is surrounded by manicured gardens, priceless sculpture, and an art collection worth hundreds of millions. It's beautiful, serene, and absolutely spotless. It's also built on what may be the most ruthlessly acquired fortune in American history. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, the man who didn't just build a business empire. He built a monopoly so complete, so all-encompassing, that the federal government had to literally break it apart to save American capitalism from itself. This is the story of how one man's obsession with control created both the greatest fortune ever assembled and a family cursed by that wealth for generations. And it's the story of an estate that became a monument to power, a prison for its inhabitants, and ultimately, a carefully managed museum designed to make you forget what really happened. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in rural New York, to a family that was, to put it charitably, complicated. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a con man who sold fake cancer cures and maintained a secret second family in another state. William would disappear for months at a time, leaving his wife Eliza to raise 6 children in poverty while he was off seducing other women and running scams. This childhood shaped John in ways that would echo through everything he did. He learned early that the world was fundamentally dishonest, that people couldn't be trusted, and that survival required absolute control over your environment. He also learned to present a respectable facade, no matter what was happening behind the scenes, a skill that would serve him well when building an empire on practices that would make his con man father proud. By age 16, John had left home and found work as a bookkeeper in Cleveland. He was meticulous, obsessive about numbers, and utterly humorless. While other young men went to saloons or chased women, Rockefeller went to church and counted money. He was a devout Baptist who neither drank nor smoked, who attended services every Sunday without fail, and who believed that God had chosen him for greatness. This combination, religious fervor and ruthless ambition, would become his defining characteristic. In 1863, at the age of 23, Rockefeller invested $4,000 in an oil refinery in Cleveland. Oil had just been discovered in Pennsylvania, and a chaotic new industry was booming. Hundreds of small refiners were competing to turn crude oil into kerosene for lamps. It was messy, competitive, and completely disorganized. Rockefeller looked at this chaos and saw opportunity. What happened next changed American capitalism forever. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. Rockefeller's approach to business wasn't innovative in the traditional sense. He didn't invent new technology or create new products. What he invented was a new way of destroying competition so thoroughly that he could control an entire industry. And he did it with a combination of brilliant strategy and practices that would later be made illegal because they were so obviously destructive to free markets. His first move was to achieve what he called horizontal integration. He began buying up other refineries in Cleveland, usually by offering the owners a choice: sell to him at his price, or he would drive them out of business. How could he make that threat credible? Because he'd already made secret deals with the railroads. This is where Rockefeller's genius and his ruthlessness really showed. In the 1860s and 70s, if you were in the oil business, you needed railroads to ship your product. The railroads charged standard rates to everyone. Except Rockefeller convinced them to give him massive rebates on shipping costs. Not only that, he convinced them to charge his competitors higher rates and then give him a kickback on those inflated charges. Let that sink in. Rockefeller's competitors were paying more to ship their oil, and that extra money was going directly to Rockefeller. He was being paid every time his competitors shipped a barrel of oil. It was one of the most audacious anti-competitive schemes in business history. With this advantage, Rockefeller could sell kerosene for less than his competitors' production costs. When they went bankrupt, he would buy their refineries for pennies on the dollar. By 1872, he controlled virtually all refining in Cleveland. But Cleveland wasn't enough. In 1870, Rockefeller had incorporated his business as Standard Oil Company of Ohio. The name was deliberate. He wanted his product to be seen as the standard, the baseline of quality. But the real standard he was setting was a new level of monopolistic control. He expanded his railroad deals to cover the entire country. He bought up competitors in New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Owners who refused to sell found their access to railroad shipping mysteriously cut off. Their banks suddenly called in their loans. Their customers received visits from Standard Oil representatives making offers they couldn't refuse. Sell to us, or lose your access to Standard's distribution network. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of oil refining in the United States. It wasn't a company anymore. It was a trust, a legal structure that allowed Rockefeller to control dozens of supposedly independent companies while presenting a fragmented appearance to regulators. The Standard Oil Trust was the first modern monopoly, and it was strangling American capitalism. Investigative journalist Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been driven out of business by Rockefeller, spent years documenting Standard Oil's practices. What she uncovered was systematic corruption on a scale that shocked even the jaded readers of the early 1900s. Standard Oil bribed politicians and state legislators to block antitrust regulations. They paid off railroad executives to discriminate against competitors. They engaged in industrial espionage, planting spies in competing companies to steal trade secrets and shipping information. They used predatory pricing to destroy local competitors, selling oil below cost in specific markets until local refiners went bankrupt, then raising prices once the competition was eliminated. In one documented case, Standard Oil discovered that a small refinery in Buffalo was undercutting their prices. Rockefeller's response was methodical and brutal. First, they identified the independent dealers selling the Buffalo refinery's oil and threatened to cut them off from Standard's products if they continued. Most dealers caved immediately. They couldn't survive without access to Standard's distribution network. The few who didn't were targeted for destruction. Standard Oil would open a competing store directly across the street, selling oil at a loss to drive the independent dealer into bankruptcy. Once the dealer closed, Standard would raise prices and close the money-losing store. The Buffalo refinery, unable to reach customers, went bankrupt within 6 months. Rockefeller bought it for $20,000, a tenth of its actual value. This pattern repeated hundreds of times across the country. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Rockefeller's empire was how he justified it. He wasn't just in it for the money, he insisted. He was bringing order to chaos. He was making industry efficient. He was doing God's work. In his mind, the small refiners he destroyed were incompetent, wasteful, and deserving of their fate. He was simply applying Darwin's principles to business, survival of the fittest. That the fittest was determined by who could be most ruthless rather than who could build the best product didn't seem to trouble him. Rockefeller attended church every Sunday, taught Sunday school, and gave generously to Baptist causes. He believed sincerely that God had blessed his work, that his wealth was a sign of divine favor. The contradiction between his public piety and his business practices was apparently invisible to him. Or perhaps he simply believed that different rules applied to the chosen. By 1900, John D. Rockefeller was the richest man in America, worth approximately $900 million, equivalent to over $300 billion in today's dollars, making him arguably the wealthiest person in human history. And he had done it by creating a monopoly so complete that the U.S. government would spend the next decade trying to dismantle it. It was at the height of his power, in the 1890s, that Rockefeller began accumulating land in Westchester County, New York. The area known as Pocantico Hills was rolling farmland with stunning views of the Hudson River and the Palisades beyond. It was close enough to New York City for convenience, but far enough away for privacy. Most importantly, it was large enough that Rockefeller could control everything within its boundaries. Control was always the point with Rockefeller. He couldn't control what the newspaper said about him, and by the 1890s, they were saying increasingly harsh things. He couldn't control the government investigators who were building an antitrust case. He couldn't control his growing army of critics who saw him as a robber baron destroying American entrepreneurship. But he could control 3,400 acres of land in Westchester County. The land purchases began in 1893 and continued for decades. Rockefeller and his agents systematically bought up every farm, every cottage, every scrap of land in the area. Sometimes the owners were willing to sell. Often they weren't. But Rockefeller always got what he wanted, one way or another. There are documented cases of Rockefeller's agents pressuring reluctant sellers through various means. Property tax assessments would mysteriously skyrocket. Banks would suddenly refuse to extend credit. Road access would be cut off. In one case, a farmer who refused to sell found his well had been contaminated. Later investigation suggested Standard Oil waste had somehow found its way into his groundwater. He sold within the month. By 1900, Rockefeller owned virtually all of Pocantico Hills. He had evicted entire families, demolished their homes, and erased communities that had existed for generations, all to create his private kingdom. The main house, which would eventually be called Kijket, Dutch for lookout, began construction in 1902. Rockefeller hired architects Delano and Aldrich to design a mansion that would reflect his status as America's richest man, while maintaining an appearance of modest respectability. The result was a 40-room neo-classical stone mansion that managed to be both enormous and somehow understated, at least compared to the grotesque excess of mansions like Vanderbilt's Biltmore. But understated is relative. Kijket featured imported marble, hand-carved woodwork, and fixtures that cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. The basement held one of the first residential generator systems in America. Rockefeller didn't trust public utilities. There were separate servants' wings, multiple kitchens, and a complex system of call buttons that allowed the family to summon staff without ever having to see them unless necessary. The grounds were even more impressive. Rockefeller hired landscape architect William Wells Bosworth to create formal Italian-style gardens with fountains, sculptures, and geometrically precise plantings. There were miles of private roads, stables for his horses, and eventually a golf course. Every tree was positioned deliberately. Every sightline was planned. Nothing was left to chance. The estate also included dozens of smaller homes for staff, greenhouses for growing food, workshops for maintaining the property, and its own power plant. Pocantico Hills wasn't just an estate. It was a self-contained world where Rockefeller could exercise complete control. But even as he was building his palace, Rockefeller's empire was under siege. In 1890, Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, designed specifically to break up monopolies like Standard Oil. For years, Rockefeller's lawyers had successfully fought off government attempts to enforce it. But in 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil, and this time they weren't backing down. The case exposed the full extent of Standard Oil's practices to public scrutiny. Testimony revealed the railroad rebates, the predatory pricing, the bribery, the industrial espionage. Witness after witness described how Standard Oil had destroyed their businesses. The evidence was overwhelming. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it broken up into 34 separate companies. It was a landmark decision, and it should have been a crushing defeat for Rockefeller. Except here's the perverse twist. Breaking up Standard Oil made Rockefeller even richer. He owned shares in all 34 of the new companies. As these companies competed and grew, the value of his shares skyrocketed. The punishment for building an illegal monopoly was becoming even wealthier. By 1913, Rockefeller's fortune had grown to over $1 billion, more than 3 times what it had been before the breakup. The American public was outraged. Here was a man who had violated the law, destroyed countless businesses, and corrupted the political system, and he was being rewarded for it. The message was clear. If you were rich enough, powerful enough, and ruthless enough, you could break any law and face no real consequences. Rockefeller's response to this criticism was to retreat further into Pocantico Hills and launch a massive public relations campaign to rehabilitate his image. He hired publicist Ivy Lee, one of the first modern PR specialists, to remake John D. Rockefeller from robber baron to kindly philanthropist. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. The transformation of Rockefeller's public image was a masterclass in reputation management. Lee's strategy was simple. Make Rockefeller seem human, approachable, and generous. Never mind that he had destroyed thousands of lives to build his fortune. Focus on what he was doing with that fortune now. Rockefeller began making highly publicized charitable donations. He gave millions to the University of Chicago, turning it into one of the nation's premier institutions. He founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which would make genuine contributions to fighting disease. He established the Rockefeller Foundation, ostensibly to promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world. The press coverage shifted almost immediately. Suddenly, stories about Rockefeller's charitable work outnumbered stories about his business practices. Carefully staged photographs showed him handing out dimes to children, a homey, grandfatherly gesture that made him seem benevolent rather than brutal. The fact that those dimes came from a fortune built on crushing competition was quietly forgotten. But here's what the public relations campaign couldn't hide. Rockefeller's own family was miserable. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was a gentle, deeply religious man who had been raised to manage the family fortune but had never wanted that responsibility. Junior, as he was called, was everything his father wasn't. Empathetic, socially conscious, troubled by the source of the family's wealth. He knew how the money had been made. He knew about the destroyed businesses, the bribed politicians, the ruthless tactics, and it ate at him. Junior's rebellion took the form of aggressive philanthropy. If his father had built the fortune through cruelty, Junior would redeem it through generosity. He gave away hundreds of millions of dollars to churches, universities, parks, and cultural institutions. He funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, donated the land for the United Nations headquarters, and supported countless social causes. But no amount of giving could change where the money came from. Junior spent his entire life trying to wash the blood off the Rockefeller fortune, and he died knowing he had failed. You can't undo history with donations, no matter how generous. Junior's wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, found her own way to cope. She threw herself into art collecting, assembling one of the finest collections of modern art in America, and helping to found the Museum of Modern Art. She spent as little time as possible at Pocantico Hills, which she found oppressive and isolating. The estate that was supposed to be a paradise felt more like a prison. Their children, John D. Rockefeller III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, grew up in a world of extraordinary privilege and psychological pressure. They were Rockefellers, which meant they were expected to be perfect, to uphold the family legacy, to manage vast wealth responsibly. The weight of that expectation crushed some of them. The Rockefeller grandchildren's lives read like a cautionary tale about inherited wealth. Each tried to escape the family shadow in their own way, and each discovered that being a Rockefeller was an identity you couldn't shed. Nelson became governor of New York and vice president of the United States, wielding enormous political power. But his presidential ambitions were repeatedly crushed, partly because Americans still didn't trust the Rockefeller name in the highest office. He died of a heart attack in 1979, allegedly in the company of a young female assistant. Under circumstances the family tried desperately to keep quiet. Winthrop moved to Arkansas, as far from the family as possible, and tried to build a different kind of life. He married a working-class woman, which scandalized the family. The marriage ended in bitter divorce, with his wife claiming the Rockefellers had never accepted her and had actively worked to undermine the relationship. Winthrop struggled with alcoholism for years before dying at 60. Michael, Nelson's son, disappeared in New Guinea in 1961 during an expedition. He was 23 years old. The official story is that he drowned while trying to swim to shore after his boat capsized. But rumors have persisted for decades that he actually made it to shore and was killed by the local Asmat tribe. Some investigators believe he was murdered in revenge for a Dutch colonial raid, and his remains were never found because the tribal members involved feared Rockefeller retribution. The family spent millions searching for Michael, but they also worked hard to suppress the more disturbing theories about his death. The idea that a Rockefeller had been killed by savages and possibly eaten was too horrifying to contemplate, too damaging to the family image. Better to say he drowned. Better to let the mystery remain unsolved than to pursue answers that might be uncomfortable. David Rockefeller, the youngest brother, lived to 101, and managed the family fortune for decades. He was brilliant, ruthless in business, though not as ruthless as his grandfather, and obsessed with maintaining the Rockefeller legacy. He also became a lightning rod for conspiracy theorists who saw him as the embodiment of secret globalist control. Some of those theories were nonsense, but some had a kernel of truth. David Rockefeller was indeed extraordinarily powerful and influential, with connections to virtually every major government and corporation in the world. Life at Kaiket itself was strange and isolated. The estate was beautiful but rigid, governed by rules both spoken and unspoken. Meals were formal affairs, even when only family was present. Dress codes were strictly enforced. Emotions were to be controlled at all times. The Rockefellers didn't shout, didn't cry in public, didn't display weakness. Children were raised by nannies and tutors, with parents maintaining a certain distance. Physical affection was rare. John D. Rockefeller Sr., even in his old age, remained a formal, intimidating presence. He would dole out financial advice and moral lectures, but rarely engaged in anything resembling normal grandparent warmth. The servants who worked at Pocantico Hills left behind memoirs that describe an atmosphere of oppressive control. Every movement was monitored. Waste of any kind was grounds for immediate dismissal. Rockefeller was fanatical about frugality, even as he sat on a billion-dollar fortune. Staff were expected to be invisible, to anticipate needs without being asked, to move through the house like ghosts. One former servant recalled being fired because she was caught eating an apple from the estate's orchard without permission. The fruit was going to rot on the ground. She protested. It didn't matter. It was theft, and theft was unforgivable, even if you were stealing a 20-cent apple from a billionaire. This was John D. Rockefeller's philosophy condensed. Absolute control, no waste, no exceptions. The same mindset that had built Standard Oil govern his household. Every penny was tracked. Every resource was managed. Nothing was left to chance or generosity. As Rockefeller aged, he became increasingly isolated at Pocantico Hills. By the 1920s, he was in his 80s and rarely left the estate. His health was declining. He suffered from digestive problems that left him able to eat only the blandest foods. His hair had fallen out from alopecia, and he wore wigs in public. His mind remained sharp, but his body was failing. He spent his days following a rigid routine. Breakfast at exactly 8 a.m., a car ride through the estate's grounds at 9, lunch at noon, an afternoon nap, light exercise, dinner at 6. Every day, exactly the same. Visitors were rare and carefully screened. He read newspapers to track his wealth and his companies, but took no active role in managing them anymore. In his final years, Rockefeller became obsessed with longevity. He wanted to live to be 100, and he approached this goal with the same methodical determination he had applied to building Standard Oil. He consulted with doctors, followed strict dietary regimens, and carefully monitored his health. Everything was about control, even death itself, if possible. He didn't quite make it. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at his winter home in Florida. He was 97 years old. His funeral at Pocantico Hills was surprisingly modest. He had left instructions for a simple service. He was buried in Cleveland, not on the estate, in a cemetery plot he had purchased decades earlier. The newspapers called him a titan of industry, a philanthropist, one of the most important figures in American history. They mentioned Standard Oil, but glossed over the monopoly, the crushed competitors, the corruption. In death, as in his final decades of life, the public relations campaign had worked. John D. Rockefeller was remembered as a great man, not a ruthless one. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. After John D.'s death, Kaiket passed to Junior, who had been managing the estate for years anyway. Junior continued living there, continued maintaining it to perfection, and continued trying to atone for his father's sins through philanthropy. But Junior was also determined to control how the family history was remembered. He funded historians and biographers, but only ones who would tell the story the way he wanted it told. He donated his father's papers to archives, but only after editing out anything too damaging. He built a mythology of the Rockefellers as benevolent stewards of wealth, conveniently omitting the predatory practices that built that wealth in the first place. The estate itself became a museum of sorts, though one carefully curated to present the right image. Junior filled Kaiket with art, sculptures by Picasso, Calder, and more in the gardens, paintings by masters in the house. It was beautiful, cultured, refined. It was everything the robber baron image wasn't. When Junior died in 1960, the estate passed to Nelson, who added more modern art and opened parts of the estate to carefully controlled tours. The Rockefellers had figured out that transparency, or at least the appearance of transparency, was good for the image. Let the public see the beautiful mansion, the impressive art collection, the manicured grounds. Let them be awed by the wealth. Just don't dwell too much on where that wealth came from. Today, Kaiket is operated by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and is open for guided tours. Visitors can walk through the mansion, admire the art, and stroll through the gardens. The tour guides tell you about the architecture, the collections, and the family's philanthropic work. They mention that John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil, but usually in passing, without details. What they don't tell you is that you're touring a monument to monopoly capitalism. That every marble floor and every bronze sculpture and every carefully manicured bush represents a small business crushed, a competitor destroyed, a community displaced. That the fortune that built and maintains this beauty came from practices that are now illegal precisely because they were so destructive. The tours don't mention Ida Tarbell or the Supreme Court decision or the thousands of people whose lives were ruined by Standard Oil's practices. They don't talk about the families evicted to create the estate or the servants fired for eating an apple. They present a sanitized history where the Rockefellers are simply wealthy patrons of art and culture, not the descendants of one of history's most ruthless monopolists. And in a way, that's the most successful part of the Rockefeller legacy. Not the wealth itself, which is now dispersed among hundreds of descendants, but the successful rewriting of history. The Rockefellers managed to transform their image from robber barons to enlightened aristocracy. They took a fortune built on crushing competition and turned it into a brand associated with philanthropy and culture. It's a magic trick when you think about it. And it worked because people want to believe in benevolent billionaires. We want to think that great wealth can be used for good, that the rich are different from us in ways that justify their wealth. The alternative, that wealth on this scale, is always built on exploitation, that billionaires are billionaires because they were willing to do things most people won't, is too uncomfortable to contemplate. But the Rockefeller story also reveals the limitations of trying to buy redemption. Junior spent hundreds of millions trying to atone for his father's sins. His children spent their lives trying to be worthy of the family name while escaping its shadow. They gave away fortunes, built institutions, and supported causes. And what do they have to show for it? The Rockefeller name is still controversial. Conspiracy theorists see them as sinister puppet masters controlling the world. Historians acknowledge their philanthropy, but can't ignore the source of the wealth. The general public knows them as old money, but couldn't tell you much about what the family has actually accomplished in the last 50 years. The foundation their philanthropy built is crumbling. The Rockefeller Foundation still exists, but is just one of many large foundations. The University of Chicago thrived, but so did universities funded by other sources. Colonial Williamsburg is a tourist attraction. The Museum of Modern Art is world-class, but would have been founded by someone else, if not the Rockefellers. In other words, the Rockefellers succeeded in giving away most of their fortune, but failed to escape the fundamental truth about that fortune. It was built on practices we now recognize as destructive and wrong. No amount of charitable giving changes that historical fact, and Kaiket stands as physical evidence of that truth. It's beautiful, yes. It's impressively maintained, absolutely. But it's also a monument to what money can buy when you acquire enough of it ruthlessly enough. It's proof that if you corner a market, crush your competitors, and bribe enough politicians, you can build a palace and fill it with art, and eventually people will forget how you paid for it. There's a sculpture garden at Kaiket that's particularly striking. It features works by some of the 20th century's most important artists: Picasso's Bathers, Giacometti's Figures, Calder's Mobiles. Walking through it, surrounded by masterpieces against the backdrop of the Hudson River, you can't help but appreciate the beauty. But then you remember that these sculptures were purchased with Standard Oil money, that Bathers was bought with profits from a monopoly, that the Giacometti was paid for by practices that destroyed countless lives. And suddenly the beauty feels tainted. This is the uncomfortable truth about great wealth. It can create genuine beauty and genuine good, but it can't escape its origins. The Rockefellers commissioned important art, funded critical medical research, and supported valuable institutions. Those contributions are real and significant, but they don't cancel out the monopoly. They don't undo the crushed competitors. They don't resurrect the businesses Standard Oil destroyed. Junior understood this, which is why he spent his entire life tormented by the family fortune. He knew that no matter how much he gave away, it would never be enough to balance the scales. David understood it too, which is why he worked so hard to control the family narrative and protect the Rockefeller image. But John D. Rockefeller Sr. never understood it. Or if he did, he didn't care. He believed to his dying day that he had done God's work, that his wealth was evidence of divine favor, that the businesses he destroyed deserved their fate. He felt no guilt, expressed no remorse, and left this world believing he would be remembered as one of history's great men. And in a perverse way, he was right. We do remember him as great, in the sense of enormously influential. Standard Oil transformed the energy industry. Rockefeller's business practices, even the illegal ones, set templates that companies still try to follow, though more carefully now. His philanthropic model of giving away vast fortunes through foundations became the standard for billionaire charity. But great doesn't mean good, and that's the lesson of Kaiket that the tour guides don't teach. Perhaps the most telling detail about Pocantico Hills is that for all its beauty and careful maintenance, none of the current generation of Rockefellers actually wants to live there full time. The estate is managed by a trust, operated as a museum, and used occasionally for family gatherings. But it's not a home anymore, if it ever really was. The younger Rockefellers have scattered across the country and the world. They use different last names, avoid publicity, and generally try to live lives that don't revolve around the family fortune. Some have renounced the wealth entirely, becoming activists or artists or academics. Others have embraced it, but with a carefully cultivated progressive image designed to distance themselves from their ancestors' legacy. None of them, as far as public records show, aspire to be the next John D. Rockefeller. None want to build empires or crush competitors or accumulate wealth for its own sake. The lesson they learned from their family history is apparently that being a Rockefeller is a burden, not a blessing. And maybe that's the real curse of Kaiket. It's not haunted by ghosts in the traditional sense. It's haunted by history, by the knowledge of what had to be done to build it, by the weight of a legacy that can't be escaped or redeemed. John D. Rockefeller built Pocantico Hills to be his kingdom, a place where he could exercise complete control and shut out a world that was increasingly critical of him. He succeeded in building that kingdom, but his descendants discovered that you can't build a wall high enough to keep out guilt, can't landscape away the truth, can't donate enough money to undo the past. Walking through Kaiket today, you're struck by how much effort goes into maintaining it. Every flower is perfect. Every hedge is precisely trimmed. Every surface is clean. The house looks like it could be moved into tomorrow. Linens on the beds, books on the shelves, everything in its place. But it's all performance. Nobody actually lives like this anymore. These formal gardens and grand rooms and elaborate routines are artifacts of a different era, when great wealth could insulate you from consequences and create your own private reality. That era is over, or at least transformed. Modern billionaires build different kinds of monuments, tech campuses, space programs, media empires. They tell different stories about their wealth, emphasizing innovation and disruption rather than tradition and permanence. They're still accumulating money and power at levels that would make Rockefeller nod in approval, but they've learned to be more subtle about it, more careful with the narrative. And yet, the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Great wealth still requires ruthlessness to acquire and maintain. Monopolies still form, just in new industries and under new names. The rich still influence government, still crush competition when possible, still live by different rules than everyone else. The difference is that we're better at pretending it's not happening, Or at convincing ourselves that this time it's different, this time it's justified, this time the billionaires really are the good guys. We've learned the lessons of the Gilded Age just well enough to make the same mistakes with better public relations. Kaiket is supposed to be a museum of a bygone era. But really, it's a mirror showing us that we haven't learned as much as we think we have. The names change, the industries evolve, but the pattern remains. Ruthless acquisition of wealth, followed by philanthropic reputation management, followed by the creation of beautiful monuments designed to make us forget how the money was made. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. On a clear day, you can stand in Kaiket's gardens and see for miles. The Hudson River Valley spreads out below, beautiful and serene. It looks untouched, natural, eternal. But that's an illusion too. Every view from Kaiket is carefully managed, every sightline planned. The forests you see are maintained by the trust. The river view is protected by zoning laws the Rockefellers helped write. Even the beauty is controlled. That's the final lesson of Pocantico Hills. That with enough money and power, you can reshape reality itself. You can buy up entire communities and erase them. You can commission historians to tell your story the way you want it told. You can build monuments that last for generations and hire guides to explain them in terms you approve. You can take a fortune built on crushing thousands of small businesses and transform it into a legacy of philanthropy and culture. You can be remembered as a great man despite practices that would be criminal today. You can build a palace on a hill and call it a museum and charge admission and have people thank you for letting them see it. John D. Rockefeller understood this better than almost anyone who ever lived. He knew that power wasn't just about having money. It was about controlling the narrative. And he succeeded spectacularly. Standard Oil is broken up and mostly forgotten, but the Rockefeller name endures, associated more with philanthropy than monopoly, more with culture than corruption. Kaiket is the physical manifestation of that success. It's beautiful. It's meticulously preserved. It's a testament to what money can create. And it's built on practices that destroyed countless lives, that had to be made illegal to prevent others from following the same path, that represent everything wrong with unregulated capitalism. Both of these things are true, and the estate forces you to hold them both in your mind simultaneously. You can admire the Picasso while remembering the monopoly. You can appreciate the gardens while acknowledging the displacement. You can recognize the genuine good the Rockefeller fortune has done while not forgetting the genuine harm that created that fortune in the first place. And maybe that's the most valuable thing Kaiket teaches us. That the world isn't simple, that good and evil can coexist in the same place, that beautiful things can have ugly origins, and that the price of great wealth is always paid by someone, even if that someone is carefully edited out of the official tour. The estate stands, perfect and preserved, a monument to John D. Rockefeller's vision of control. But it's also, whether intentionally or not, a monument to the costs of that control. The families displaced. The competitors destroyed, the democratic principles corrupted, the children and grandchildren burdened with a legacy they can't escape. Beautiful gardens, priceless art, a fortune measured in billions. And underneath it all, the same question that haunts every great estate. Was it worth it? Did the beauty justify the brutality? Can philanthropy redeem ruthlessness? John D. Rockefeller would have said yes without hesitation. His descendants aren't so sure. And the rest of us are left to tour the estate and decide for ourselves.